Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Motion to uncircle HJR08.
Motion is to uncircle HJR08, joint resolution calling for a convention to amend the Constitution of the United States. Would you like to speak to that motion?
Yes, I would. To the motion uncircled, I think
yes.
it's time to move forward on this, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Discussion to the motion to uncircle. Seeing no lights, I'll place the motion. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Rule that motion carries. The bill is uncircled and before us. Representative Ivory.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was thinking obviously a great deal about what I might say on this, and we've said a lot. We've heard a lot. There's a lot that's been out there all around on this issue. And so as I got to thinking, I remember when I was called to serve in a local church position, and problems would come up, as problems always come up in organizations. And being new to the church organization, I thought, well, I've got a great idea for that. And the leader would say, well, let's look at the handbook. And then another problem would come up, and I'd have this great creative idea, and he would say, I got a great idea. Let's look at the handbook. Colleagues, we have the greatest handbook that was ever devised in the history of government. In fact, even our adversaries, William Gladstone, said this is the greatest work ever struck off by the brain or purpose of man. The founders called it a miracle repeatedly. And think about the miracle. It's beautifully simple. There are 7 articles in the Constitution that divide power among different depositories. First, they divide it between state and federal government, and then within the federal government, it's divided between 3 branches. And so Article 1 is Congress, and Congress shall execute the laws, not agencies. Article 2 is the President, and the President shall faithfully execute the laws, not make them. Article 3 is the courts, and they're the umpire. Call balls and strikes, but don't weigh into the political field. And then Article 4 is the states, that the states would have republican forms of government and be equal, distinct, and equal sovereigns. And then Article 5, of course, is how we amend it. George Washington was written by Hamilton. We get to see the Hamilton resolution shortly. But Alexander Hamilton wrote George Washington's farewell address largely, and he says, if in the opinion of the people, the distribution or modification of the constitutional powers be in any particular wrong, let it be changed by an amendment in the way in which the Constitution designates. But let there be no change by usurpation, for though in one instance this may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. Colleagues, we're seeing our government destroyed in front of our eyes. We see a court that is now weighing in and deciding what rights are rather than being an umpire. We see Congress that is $2 trillion just in the last year the debt's increased. We see a president that's legislating with a phone and a pen, and it really isn't without regard to party. It's happening in the executive regardless. So nothing has changed in this resolution since last year. It's the same resolution. It does 3 things that allows us to fix the system, this unique, beautiful system that allocated and distributed power and checks and balances among state and national government, and then within the 3 branches of the federal government. That system is broken. And if we don't fix the system, we can build all the beautiful sandcastles we want on the beach, and the federal tide comes and washes them away one after the other. So here's the resolution. We had it last year. It's very simple. Impose fiscal restraints on the federal government. The debt increased $1 trillion just in the last 3 months when they removed the debt ceiling. The second is to impose jurisdictional limits on the federal government. Limit the jurisdiction of the federal government. We see it running into every area that affects every aspect of our lives. The third is to consider term limits on federal officers. And that's the resolution. That allows us to meet and discuss. We can't do what we can't first discuss. And nothing has changed in that. What has changed is from last year when we considered this, not only $1 trillion, we're $2 trillion more in debt, 2,000 new regulations, 80,000 pages of regulations. I asked our staff, we don't even read them. The regulations that affect our citizens every day, our own staff can't even keep up with them. And of course, we've got our president legislating with a pen, and we've got courts that are now deciding everything under the sun. We now have a 4-4 on the court, and we have 4 that don't think we should have a Second Amendment. And it's hard to know where that's going. We have the power to affect the distribution and modification as George Washington, as written by Hamilton, told us. Let it be done by an amendment in the way in which the Constitution designates. Speaker, it's time. 7 other states have already moved on this specific amendment with this specific language. It's big enough to solve the overall problems of the system that we have, the breakdown in the system. And with that, I would stand for questions.
Thank you. Discussion to the bill. Representative Powell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this resolution. I have worked with many people in this body on this issue over the years, and I want to compliment the good representative sponsor for all of his work. I think that what I would say about this resolution is we have to decide what we are most afraid of. I think we have to decide if we're most afraid of a current situation in which a national government has exercised such overbearing control that the states and our role in the system of government set up by this very Constitution has almost become non-existent. And are we afraid of a national government that not only through its legislative branch, but through its executive branch and even through its judicial branch has, even in the half-century since we first began having this debate about whether a convention of states would be a good thing, has gone so far beyond what anyone could even imagine at that point that becomes, I think, it has to be the greatest fear that we can have in our country. But instead, we are talking about only a proposal that states get together and meet to discuss whether something can be done that was envisioned by our founders for, in fact, exactly this scenario. A scenario in which the federal government has begun to overtake the prerogatives and the desires of the states. It is, in fact, exactly what the founders wanted us to do, to have this sort of a convention meeting. Now, for those who wonder and worry whether the convention itself would somehow, in a sweep of some efficacy, have a brand new constitution or amendments that we could not support proposed, I urge you to think of the experience that you know in a legislature as legislative bodies. In fact, this summer here in this very room, there was an assembly of states held. Many of us participated in that, and on this topic, many states came to begin to discuss the rules that we will follow when this convention is ultimately held. And the one lesson that I want to share with you from that is it was very hard to get agreement on any topic that we discussed. Why? Because we had 40 or so states represented here in this room, and coming to any decision or any consensus on a particular proposal took time. It took a legislative process that we're all familiar with, and ultimately those things that we came up with were consensus and were good policy. I suggest that that's exactly what's going to happen when this convention of states is convened, and the most important thing you can count on is that they will be your state legislator brothers and sisters who have the same motives, who have the same desires that you do, and finally we'll be able to restore this rightful balance that our framers envisioned, that we have come so far away from. So I strongly support this resolution and encourage you to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you. Further discussion. Representative Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to speak in favor of this resolution. This is one of the most important resolutions we'll consider, one of the most important actions we will take. I would like to address some of the concerns that you've all received by constituents who are concerned about our Constitution and love our Constitution. Their first and primary concern is that this event will destroy our Constitution. They characterize it as a constitutional convention, and that is the first error. This is not a proposed constitutional convention. This is an amendment convention of the states. State delegates gather to propose amendments to the Constitution. It cannot run away. It is limited in scope by the call for the convention, by the resolutions. It's limited by restrictions on delegates that will attend the convention. It's limited by restrictive rules and procedures that the prior speaker referred to as we meet in an assembly of state legislatures and talk about rules and procedures. And finally, the ultimate protection is ratification by 3/4 of the states. Whatever comes out of this amendment convention must be ratified by 3/4 of the states. If the states don't like it, they defeat it. It takes only 13 states to defeat whatever is proposed by this convention. I also must refer to the purpose of Article 5 itself. Article 5 provides, as you know, 2 ways to amend the Constitution. One is through Congress. Congress initiates, and that is the procedure typically followed. Our founders purposely provided a second way to amend the Constitution for this very situation in which Congress would refuse to act. Congress would refuse to amend. The founders provided this way for the states themselves to rise up and propose changes to the Constitution that Congress would refuse to follow. It is interesting to me that the most ardent defenders of the Constitution are the most hesitant to trust in the Constitution, to trust in Article 5 provided and the procedure provided by our founders for states to reassert themselves. Finally, once we satisfy the primary concerns of the opponents of an amendment convention, all they can say is, well, yeah, I see all of this, but now is not the time, they say. Well, I can tell you that now is the time. There is no better time. All 3 branches of the federal government have exceeded their delegated powers under the Constitution and have encroached on the sovereignty of the states. The President issues unauthorized executive orders. His administrators issue unauthorized rulings, regulations that go beyond the scope of the statutes. One example is the attempt to outlaw the use of coal in our country. Congress appears to be paralyzed. We talk about 3 branches of government and checks and balances, but Congress appears most of the time paralyzed, unable to check the excesses of the President or his administrative agencies. And they are, of course, faced in the Senate by the filibuster power that requires 60 votes for everything and is difficult to get. And finally, Congress has exceeded its power by addressing matters traditionally left to the states: health care and education, police power, family law, and so forth. The federal courts have also exceeded their powers by encroaching into areas traditionally reserved to the states. 20% of our state budget now is focused on administering and enforcing federal programs. States are now little more than agencies of the federal government to carry out federal programs. Now is the time for states to push back. As you know, I'm a strong proponent of a countermand amendment, which would authorize states to override provisions of federal law, whether statute or regulation. The governor of Texas recently issued a Texas plan which would include a countermand amendment that would authorize states to override federal provisions deemed harmful to the states. Today, the federal government would be totally unrecognizable to our founders. It has so far exceeded its delegated powers. Today, the Constitution is hanging in the balance, and now is the time for the states to step forward, assert themselves, and rebalance the federalism in this country. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Further discussion. Representative Briscoe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I love this document. We raise our hands when we're sworn into this body, and we take an oath to protect the Constitution of the United States of America. And the Constitution states that every elected official, federal and state, will take an oath to protect and defend and preserve the Constitution of the United States, and I take that oath very seriously. Perhaps I'm wrong on this issue. Perhaps I should be embracing the concept of voting for this petition to send it on to the Congress so that they shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case should be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution. It's not that we haven't amended the Constitution. Over 10,000 amendments have been proposed to the U.S. Constitution. We passed 27 of them because of the high bar that's been noted. So we've been judicious. We did 10 of them in one fell swoop. We took a look at James Madison, collected issues from the states, and put together 13 amendments. And we did, in one package, 10 amendments, which we call the Bill of Rights. We've done it 17 times since, and there are others on the books. I get hit up from the left. People in this corner of the room get an awful lot of emails and communications from the wolf pack that wants an Article 5 convention because they want to write into the Constitution an end to Citizens United and put restrictions on campaign spending and how campaigns are financed in the United States, and I have a lot of empathy with that. I don't care whether it's Obama. I don't care whether it's Romney. I don't care whether it's Clinton or Sanders or Trump or Rubio or whoever. The amount of money we're raising to spend on presidential campaigns, IMHO, is obscene and doesn't lead to good. But there's no limit in the Article 5. As I read Article 5 up in front of my screen, shall call a convention if 2/3 of the state legislatures petition Congress to call a convention shall be, and that's the word you use to insist that it will occur, shall call a convention for proposing amendments. Is there anything to prevent them from proposing a substitute? We do a substitute bill when the amendments are significant enough. My other concern is the sweeping nature of the resolution that's before us. For the calling a convention of the states limited to proposing amendments to the Constitution of the United States that impose fiscal restraints on the federal government. I understand the intent, but I think that's a pretty big door. That's a C-130 plane dropping, tanks and jeeps off over the battlefield. Fiscal restraints on the federal government. There's an awful lot of things you could propose there. Limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. That is huge. That is incredible. Limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. And we have on our desk that, Governor Abbott of Texas, my son used to live in Houston, he now lives in Oregon. I mean, they do a lot of good things in Texas, but I don't know that I am, just because he's the governor of Texas, I'm interested in allowing a 2/3 majority of the states to override a U.S. Supreme Court decision. I have some concerns about that proposal. We have an amendment process that we've used 27 times. Maybe there's a reason why we haven't done the convention of the states, and maybe it's because we've been a little bit skittish, because the first time we met, they kind of did a circumvention. And I've read very carefully all the notes that have been placed on our desk the last 3 or 4 years, and maybe some of simply the words you use. But there's nothing to prevent the billions of dollars that people have out there through dark super PACs, or we don't need to know where they're getting their money from, to put out and build a political case for bypassing some rules. The other thing we did, I sat in these seats this summer with delegates from numerous other states working on what would the rules be if this convention were held. And it is true we had a hard time reaching agreement on a number of issues. But the one thing I did hear us say was, when they get together, they can do as they will. And the reason why we're getting together to propose these rules is so they have a little bit of a blueprint to use should the convention happen. But there was agreement, as I understood it, that once they get together, they will do as they will. So maybe I'm wrong, but I'm voting no. Thank you.
Thank you. Further discussion. Representative Christofferson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A lot of the things that I was prepared to say have been discussed already. The big thing that I get as I talk to some members of my district are, that they have a fear of what's going to happen in a convention to propose amendments. And to me, I say, what is the biggest thing that could happen there? I mean, what if we adopted the Communist Manifesto? Do you think that 13 states are not going to oppose that when it comes out? So I look at that, I said, what is the biggest fear? The biggest fear to me is $19 trillion of debt. That's a national threat. The biggest fear to me is the overreach of our executive branch and the inaction of Congress, and also our judiciary branch that seems to want to legislate from the bench. Those are things that have happened that we didn't think would ever happen, and the founders of the Constitution, the founders of our government, realized that in Article 5 we have the power as states to take back some of the balance in power and resolve some of the problems that we see as states. As states, we created the federal government, the national government. And this gives us an opportunity to correct problems in that creature that we created. Today in our committee, we discussed an amendment or a resolution to repeal the 17th Amendment. Well, how's that going to happen if we do that? The only way that that's going to happen, I think, is through a convention, because I don't think that Congress will act on that. I think that they're going to balk at that. After a convention is to propose amendments is held, there are high standards. They'll work out the rules, and the same procedure will happen after the convention is over to ratify the amendments, as does Congress. And to me, I have a lot more faith in us states than I do in Congress to do the right thing. Anyway, I urge your support on this resolution. Thank you.
Thank you. Further discussion? Representative Elison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the sponsor yield for a question?
Will the sponsor yield?
Yes.
Proceed.
Will you please explain to the body how many independent legislative houses would have to agree to an amendment after a convention were to be held, and you can clarify if Nebraska is included or not?
Certainly, and for the clarification, we have two houses in every state except Nebraska. So a House and a Senate. Nebraska is unicameral, so that's 99 legislative bodies. Whether an amendment is proposed by Congress, 2/3, or proposed by 2/3 of the states, the ratification procedure is the same. It requires 3/4 of those 99 legislative bodies, which means not just 13 states could block, but 13 houses of those 99 could block an amendment that was somehow deemed unsavory to the people.
So what you're saying is that there's a very high barrier to some sort of rogue amendment going through because of the number of bodies that would have to all agree on a majority basis.
Yes, it's interesting. We had the historic district bill earlier this year, and we wanted to put difficult requirements to create a historic district, and we required a 1/3 application and 50% plus one of so many diverse interests, and that was a difficult, high barrier. In fact, some spoke against how high the barrier was. The founders knew. They put a check of 3/4. Politically, that is tremendous. And so anything discussed in a convention for proposing amendments, Mr. Speaker, would necessarily need to be something that would be reasonable enough that could pass 3/4 of 99 legislative bodies. There would be no point in meeting in a convention to discuss whether or not to propose amendments and to send something out that is a non-starter, where you don't have even a chance of getting to 3/4 of the states. That limits even the very nature of what's discussed at a convention.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Further discussion, Representative Snow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Most of the conversation and most of the communications I've received from people opposing this, the theme is the same. And the theme is, we are afraid. We fear. We are afraid of this process that is delineated in the Constitution that we think so highly of, and in many cases believe in some ways that it's in jeopardy. One of the things that I have said before I arrived, and even in the legislature, and more so since I've been involved, is the importance of the process. And sometimes we forget that. We think about the vote and getting the bill through and getting the decision made, but the process is incredibly important because it is the process that allows us to stay connected to the people. It allows us to stay true to our fiduciary, our fidelity to the people. And Article 5 is just one way that allows us to do that, to exercise a process. Maybe never arrive at an amendment, but I'm not afraid to exercise the process. It made sense when it was made. It was made sense when it was put in our Constitution. It's still there. And I don't think we should be afraid of that process. The other reason I don't think we should be afraid is it's a way to connect our system of government, which is self-governance, with the power residing in the people, back to the people, from where the power to govern comes from. And we've lost sight of that. And we, in many ways, continue to think that the answers of this great nation still reside in Washington, D.C. They don't. The answers to the challenges reside with the people, especially the most difficult challenges. And I'm voting for this because I have faith in the people, from where the power to govern emanates, and I have faith in the process. And I do not believe that there's anything about the process that's going to give rise to all of the fears that have been characterized and propagated by those who oppose this process. Part of that comes from my involvement in some respects of the process and the assemblies leading up to potentially a convention. The assemblies that we held in this very body, of which I was a named delegate, proud to represent Utah, not to formulate amendments, but to simply begin formulating potentially some rules that would govern the process. I'm a big fan of the process, and I'm speaking to that today and would ask for your support. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Further discussion, Representative Hollins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the sponsor of the bill please yield to a question?
Certainly.
Will the sponsor yield?
Certainly.
Proceed.
When the Constitution was written, it was not written to protect everyone. We all know that. How do I know that everyone's rights will be protected under this convention?
That's a great question, Representative. I'm very grateful you asked that question. Frederick Douglass had that same thought initially. And he thought that when there was a 3/5 provision in the Constitution, he thought that that was discriminatory, and that meant that African American people were 3/5 of a person, and nothing could be further from the truth. As Frederick Douglass poured through the Constitution and poured through the debates, he realized that that was a provision to sow the seeds to the destruction of slavery. And Frederick Douglass became a great friend of Abraham Lincoln. and they did as much as they could. They moved as far as they could. I can't even imagine. I don't think we could imagine living in a society that made abolishing slavery illegal. That was in the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson put in the very first draft that the king, one of the abuses, the king would not allow them to make slavery illegal. We can't even imagine that today. It was illegal to make slavery illegal. And so they took as many steps as they could. By 1808, many of the vestiges of slavery would be gone. And it sowed the seeds of discord that, as Frederick Douglass said, completely eroded that foundation that was indeed, Representative, horrific in our nation's history. So the Constitution did sow the seeds to make that happen. And then, as you'll know, just as George Washington said, if, in the opinion of the people, the modification or distribution of the powers be wrong in any particular, let it be changed by an amendment in the way which the Constitution designates. And we did that. We did that. We amended the Constitution to fix what is a horrific moment in the history of our United States. And we're now in moments where, very similarly, well, I shouldn't say similarly, excuse me, strike that. We're in a situation now where there is such an imbalance of power that the federal government is exerting its chains, exerting its power over the most local aspect of our lives. Whether or not in Price they can continue to have their communities flourish the way they have for centuries. Whether or not in Garfield County they can continue to harvest trees so they have a safe forest and not be subject to a catastrophic fire risk at every moment. Whether or not we can continue to educate our own children instead of from Washington. Those are critical questions that, again, we can solve by amendment the way we've solved these other critical problems.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Considering the climate of this country right now, I am not comfortable with this convention. I am not only talking about for people, minorities, but I'm also talking about those individuals who are poor. I'm afraid that their voice will not be heard. It would be, once again, people, the rich and the powerful, who will be sitting at the table making these decisions without everybody's voice being heard. Thank you.
Thank you. Further discussion. Representative Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the sponsor yield to a question?
Will sponsor yield to a question?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Proceed.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to have a better understanding, because I've got an email here from actually a member of the body that reflects a different understanding than what I had related to how a convention of states would be structured and how the voting would occur, in which states or in which manner the states would vote. Is it proportional based on population and representation in Congress, or is it based off of one state, one vote?
Thank you, Representative. The Supreme Court, the very first convention that was called after the Constitution was ratified, was called by Virginia, and Virginia coined the phrase a convention of states. The Supreme Court later, addressing Article 5 issues, and by the way, the Supreme Court courts have addressed Article 5 issues more than 40 times, including limiting the scope by the applications. But when they call it a convention of states, it is states that vote. It has always been one vote, one state, one vote. There were 33 conventions leading up to 1787. And so it informed their history of what a convention of states looked like. And in all of those, it was one state, one vote. The Constitutional Convention, one state, one vote. And so similarly, the history and the nature of this is very clearly one state, one vote, or it would not be a convention of states.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the answer. That's actually the answer that I was looking for. This is an important discussion we're having, but I can't think of an issue as a state that we could get involved in that would have a bigger impact on the future of our country and the future of Utah. You know, I think it's interesting that we've got a number of people that are objecting to this discussion and objecting to moving this forward because it is based oftentimes in irrational fear, in my perspective. I also think that We brag a lot about how well the states are managed, and we brag a lot about how Utah is one of the best managed states and does this better and that better. I can't think of a better way for us to get involved and share best practices and try to set the ship in the right direction than getting something like this to occur and getting the right people around the table to try to fix the trajectory of the country. You know, I'm not one that typically rattles the saber around these types of federalism issues, but this is an important discussion. I applaud the sponsor for his bringing this forth, and I fully support this. Thank you.
Thank you. Further discussion. Representative Christensen.
Thank you. Representatives, my sense is that you've probably already read, studied, thought, pondered, perhaps already reached your decision on this. If you're open to just a few additional thoughts, can I share a few with you that I hope are germane? This proposal originated, not the concept, but the structure originated in a conference that was held about 2 years ago at Mount Vernon. Place that I cherish and beat a path to as often as I can in life, dreamed of as a boy. Told my parents one night at dinner when I was about 10, I said, guess, Mom and Dad, when I'm big, I want to be a lawyer. My dad said, why, son? I said, because Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams.
Questions that come up, whatever.
I dreamed that maybe one day, I would be there. But I was invited to go, and at the last minute chose not to because I was afraid of a moment just like this, that I wouldn't be free to continue to ponder, to study, to make a thorough, principled decision, that indeed, rather than go there and consider something and draw a conclusion, you would be enlisted and irrevocably tied to whatever had to be done to bring us to this point. It seems like everyone that went to it has done just that. I respect their viewpoint, I respect their effort, but that's why I was concerned. I wanted to be free to be independent and objective and principled and thorough. On balance, as much as I support these three concepts, can I tell you why I don't think this is the right way to go? I think this is the ultimate potential for unintended consequences. There's the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. There is a straighter line to do these things. This isn't just some paranoid fear of any and all constitutional conventions. If you read Article 3 of the Constitution, they were only authorized to create the Supreme Court and such inferior courts as Congress shall later determine. The entire judicial system could be overnight changed because there was a subsequent Judiciary Act that could be redone. We could meet together in any capacity quicker, sooner, more effectively, and go and transform Congress. We could control elections. There are so many things that can be done. There is a different path. To force yourself to balance the budget, do you realize we had a resolution? If we tried as a nation to have a mandatory balanced budget amendment, we'd have to fill it with emergency exceptions for war. Hamilton, in a book called Hamilton's Blessing, at a time when our debt was less than $1 trillion after World War II for everything we had ever done up until then, he said, how will we ever defend ourselves? Do you realize that any nation could declare war on us the day after our fiscal year ended? If you couldn't borrow against your home, if you lost your job or had a tragedy, there had to be a prudent way to do it under certain circumstances. There are so many things that need to be addressed, but to just simply say, we're going to go meet to propose amendments yet to be determined. They're going to fall under three broad categories. We'll see if we like them. We reserve the right to withdraw from them later if we don't. I respect everyone's viewpoint on this, but I would just point out to you that, and people have gone with different versions. The founders, what an era, what a generation. But when Adam said our Constitution was designed solely for a moral and a religious people, it's unsuited for any other. Oh, that we return back to public virtue. Oh, that we realize those things. Oh, that we remember that all truths are self-evident, the ones that our principles are founded upon. But if we look here, I would just simply say, when Scalia, they quote him one way or the other, but more recently, he said this is the wrong century to try to do something like this. I think we're operating on a flawed premise that Article 5 is just this euphoric process that has no risk whatsoever. It's not the unreasoned, blank check fears that some people have, but if you crawl into the details of it, there's a better way. There's a better way to do this. But to be told, don't worry, don't worry, don't worry, it'll somehow be just fine. I look at this, and like I say, it's also not a referendum on a popular author who wrote about liberty amendments. I've read every one of them. His book on Men in Black, his book on plunder and deceit. We understand. But when you think it all the way through, thank heavens when the Equal Rights Amendment was proposed, it was a specific amendment. It went out, but it didn't have the support in the end. It was flawed but well intended. Karl Marx, of all people, said this, and it's chilling. A people severed from their roots are easily moved. The Supreme Court promised us that any implied rights had to be deeply rooted in our nation's history, tradition, and norms. Severed from our roots, let's not just go amend the Constitution. Let's go back and reaffirm the founding principles, the founding virtues, the era, the climate, the inspired setting. I don't see that same setting. I think there's a better way. I think we can accomplish the same outcome. We could gather, and I hope that we will, but to just simply empower them to go off, it'd be like picking 3 of our committees. Let the Education Committee, the Political Subdivisions Committee, and the Government Operations just go off by themselves, and we'll just accept whatever those 3 do, and then we'll come back and look at it later. There's so many analogies and metaphors that could be used. But again, I want to be understood that I have the same worries, the same concerns that people are trying to achieve. Sometimes I think we can be a mile wide and an inch deep. If we go deeper and deeper and deeper and look at this, I think there's a better way, a different way, a more direct way. And I think that the ultimate unintended consequences that I see not in just some general unreasoned thought process, but with a very thorough process, I just would respectfully submit that this particular movement that started at that conference a couple years ago, which led to some of the meetings since, it requires analysis further, and so I'll be voting against it, but very much sharing your concerns about the conditions in which we live. But I believe that a reaffirmation of our Constitution and that we, the people, with the 9th and 10th Amendment and all the powers that are embodied in it, keep in mind that the founders, in order to persuade the states in the chaos of the Articles of Confederation, to persuade the states to set aside their fears and to come forward and unite and become the United States of America, they included the 9th and the 10th, the Bill of Rights, and even Article 5. And there's a right way and a wrong way to do it, but I think that this is so unfettered. I don't think this is the version that the founders had in mind. It may yet be a vehicle to come, but I think that this is this movement, although well-intended, I think doesn't have the principled restraints that it needs. I hope that this helps the dialogue and the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me break in. Speaker announces a Rules Committee meeting. Rules Committee meeting for members of the Rules Committee in the Majority Caucus room. Speaker announces a Rules Committee meeting. Further discussion. Let me go to Representative Grover.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would move previous question.
Previous question has been called. Has the effect of ending debate. Non-debatable motion. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. Rule that motion passes. Division's been called. If 5 or more will stand, we will be in division. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Voting will now be open on the motion to call the question, which has the effect of ending debate. Madam Marine Clerk reminds me that the call to question does require 2/3 of a vote. So let's all vote, representatives, quickly. Okay, I've got. Seeing all present having voted, voting will now be closed. The motion to call previous question, having received 54 yes votes, 17 no votes, receives the constitutional two-thirds requirement and passes. Back to the sponsor of the bill for summation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the discussion that we've had. There's been a lot of discussion around this throughout the last few weeks. There will continue to be more discussion, as there ought to be. I think I can summarize the discussion in perhaps 3 constitutions. Mr. Speaker, we have currently in the United States 3 constitutions. We have the 0% Constitution. That's the one that's in Washington. The 0% Constitution is when they asked the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, under what constitutional authority did you pass the bill to invade into health care? And her response was, are you serious? In Washington, we have a 0% Constitution. In fact, they don't even look or debate anymore as they used to what the constitutional provisions are for their actions. They simply act because they can, and the Supreme Court upholds what they're doing. We also have a 6/7 Constitution. That's the Constitution where only 6 of the articles should we consider to use. And under 6/7 of the Constitution, we effectively get the 0% Constitution. Because if we're looking at 6/7, then there is no effective check on the 0% Constitution that is happening in Washington every day. And then, of course, we have the 100% Constitution. And I agree with the representative from Draper. We need to reaffirm the 100% Constitution. We need to not be severed from our roots, and we need to reinstill the principles of our 100% Constitution. Because if we don't, we get this. We get the 0% Constitution by default. Doing nothing means agencies will continue to take over water, enacting law, executing law, adjudicating law by unelected agencies. Will continue to get presidents that enact law with the pen. We get a court that enters into the playing field of public policy if we continue with the 0% Constitution. One thing that the representative from Draper said that I have to really take issue with, he mentioned the Mount Vernon Assembly as somehow of means that were inappropriate. There were a number of us that were there. The only reason there was a limit, it was the very first time that people got together to discuss process. It had nothing to do with this particular movement of an amendment, but to discuss process. And the reason it was limited is because that's all the chairs they had. The Mount Vernon Library is only so big, and it was first come, first serve. Anyone that wanted to be there logged in, and they were there. And we began this process of discussing what would this procedure look like. I'm so proud of the representative from St. George who was here in this body as our delegate, and we learned a great deal from that when we were here with delegates from around the nation. One of the things that we learned, Mr. Speaker, there were Republicans and Democrats in that assembly, and there was a gentleman, a senator from Ohio, Bill Patman, African-American gentleman, Democrat from Ohio, who was in that assembly. And through the proceeding, he distinguished himself so effectively in how he carried himself and argued the issues and worked with his colleagues. I don't think there's a single person in that body that would not vote for him to be chairman of the next assembly. Leaders rise to the top. That's what happened in Annapolis before we ever got to Philadelphia. Leaders rise to the top. And in Utah, we have the opportunity to be leaders among leaders. In the Transportation Committee this morning, the good senator from Utah County mentioned the Constitution was established from east to west. It should be saved from west to east. We have the opportunity, knowing what we know, to be leaders among leaders. Now, in the process, in our Federalism Commission, we're going to be going through how we carry what we do into a convention of states to propose amendments, that we have our own strategy and we choose our delegates. Imagine the delegates we could choose. Senator Mike Lee, good representative from St. George, a good representative from Grantsville, distinguished legal minds. Our Senate president, who sat right up there in this assembly of state legislatures and conducted himself so well with esteem among people across the nation. Our young, scrappy, and hungry speaker here, who would go and battle for our state and the rights of our state. Think of the delegates we could send. Now, as we send delegates, they're our agents. They are agents of the state. Like any agency relationship, we can call our agents home. We give them specific instructions. And in fact, we already have a law in Utah. If our agents violate the scope of the agency that we give them going to a convention, it's a crime in Utah. This is a serious matter, but yet the impacts that we have in our nation are also tremendously serious. The representative mentioned the climate in our country. We have an African-American president. We have two leading candidates for president that are Hispanic. When they talk about the rich and the powerful behind closed doors in Washington buy their favors by the minute. Our good Senator Mike Lee called it the dysfunctional favor bank. Our good colleague from South Jordan mentioned that in the omnibus bill just last month, a $2 trillion omnibus bill with 11,000 earmarks that are simply trading favors with the tax dollars of your constituents. When we talk about the poor, those on fixed incomes, their life and their livelihood is being traded away in Washington by the minute. We had just $2 trillion worth of it just a couple of months ago. The representative from Salt Lake mentioned our oath. He mentioned that the original convention was somehow run away in Philadelphia. Nothing could be further from the truth, because they didn't have a constitution at the time. They had an Articles of Convention that was not working. They met as states under their plenary sovereign power as states. And in fact, James Madison says the power of the convention ought in strictness to be determined by an inspection of the commissions given the members of their respective constituents. He then spends the balance of Federalist 40 proving that the delegates from all the states properly followed their directions. To think that the first act of our country was somehow ill-gotten or inappropriate, I find that to be misguided. The application sets the agenda. When 2/3 of the states call the convention, those applications set the agenda. Think about what we are facing in our nation. Not just a balanced budget that the representative from Draper said, not just whether we increase spending to balance the budget, but fiscal restraints. We have the opportunity, think about that, we have the opportunity to discuss fiscal restraints where 30% of our state revenue is dependent on a federal government that itself every year says is broke. To discuss the totality of how do we bring into balance in a reasonable fashion fiscal restraints. We have the opportunity to discuss whether or not to propose amendments on the jurisdiction of the federal government. The representative from Draper said that that's so open-ended. It's not. It's a one-way street. To discuss limits, not up. The 0% Constitution has given us increased jurisdiction of the federal government for 100 years. And we'll continue to get increased jurisdiction of the federal government under the 0% Constitution. Under the 100% Constitution, we get to discuss limits and restore that balance, which Madison said in Federalist 45, that the balance, when they divided power, was to be few and defined at the federal level and numerous and indefinite closest to the people. Imagine the opportunity to discuss limits, to get back to that balance that Washington said, if it be wrong in any particular, let it be changed by an amendment, but not by usurpation. And then we also get to discuss whether or not life tenure on the Supreme Court. When we have 4-4 now, we don't know what the Second Amendment looks like next year. We don't know what marital relationships look like next year. We don't know what education looks like next year. We don't know what agencies exercising their power over water and power and our energy looks like next year. Because that's where our Supreme Court sits right now. Imagine the opportunity to discuss limits. Mr. Speaker, history, in fact, does have its eyes on us right now. We have a power, and as the representative from Salt Lake said, we swore an oath to all 7 articles. And we have a power, and with that power comes a choice. With choice comes responsibility. But not to choose is to choose. And history does, in fact, have its eyes on us. Mr. Speaker, thank you, and I would very much encourage your support that we can, in Utah, be leaders among leaders as we go forward in this. Thank you.
Thank you. Voting will now be open on HJR08, joint resolution calling for a convention to amend the Constitution of the United States. Seeing all present having voted, voting will now be closed. HJR08, having received 41 yes votes, 33 no votes, passes this body and will be transmitted to the Senate for its consideration.